6 weeks after the first human ship had arrived at the edge of Altarian space, the war that had threatened to destroy 12 civilizations was over, and the Korthak Dominion had surrendered unconditionally as their surviving forces fled to the outer rim of the galaxy, carrying terrified warnings about the deathworlders from Sol, who hunted in the darkness between stars. The Great Hall of Zentara Prime was filled once again with representatives from the grateful species, but the atmosphere was completely different from the desperate meeting that had led to humanity's involvement, as the aliens now looked at their human saviors with a complex mixture of gratitude and primal fear that they could not entirely suppress. Commander Velox stood at the same podium where he had announced the approaching extinction of his people, and he addressed the assembly with a voice that shook not from despair, but from the deep recognition that the galaxy had fundamentally changed, and that the peaceful age of their civilizations had ended, whether the Korthak had won or lost. The holographic displays around the chamber now showed a very different story, as world after world reported liberation from the Korthak threat, and evacuation fleets were returning to their homeworlds, and the massive reconstruction efforts that would be needed to rebuild what had been destroyed, and the representatives spoke of their gratitude, but their words carried undertones of uncertainty about what came next. Admiral Jake Morrison had traveled from Earth to attend the ceremony, and he sat quietly among the alien delegates wearing his dress uniform and listening to the speeches of thanks, but every being in the chamber could sense the coiled predator beneath the surface, and they understood that they were in the presence of something fundamentally dangerous. Dr. Lisa Chang accompanied the Admiral as Earth's cultural liaison, and she had spent the journey preparing briefings about how humanity might integrate with galactic civilization, but her real purpose was to help the aliens understand that humans distinguished between threats and innocent civilians, and that Earth had no intention of replacing the Korthak as a galactic menace ambassador. Nith from the Prism Worlds activated her crystalline form and projected a comprehensive analysis of the human military intervention, and the data showed that fewer than 2,000 human soldiers had accomplished what the combined fleets of 12 species had failed to achieve, and the implications of this technological and tactical superiority were not lost on anyone present. Senior Counselor Zeph spoke for the assembled civilizations as he formally thanked Earth for its intervention and acknowledged that humanity had saved them from extinction, but his words were carefully chosen to avoid any implications that the aliens now owed the humans anything beyond gratitude and basic diplomatic courtesy. Colonel Danny Carter attended the ceremony as representative of Earth's Special Forces, and his presence served as a reminder to the aliens that the gentle humans who spoke of peace and cooperation were backed by warriors who had just demonstrated their ability to eliminate any threat to galactic stability. The discussion turned to practical matters as the alien representatives asked about humanity's intentions regarding ongoing galactic affairs and whether Earth would establish permanent military bases or demand tribute from the species they had saved, and Morrison's response was carefully measured as he explained that humans preferred to be left alone but would respond to future threats against peaceful civilizations. Commander Rachel Torres provided a detailed briefing on the final disposition of Korthak forces, and she reported that the survivors had been allowed to flee to uninhabited systems on the condition that they never again threaten civilized worlds, and that human monitoring stations would ensure compliance with these terms. The aliens learned that Earth's forces had not simply defeated the Korthak, but had completely dismantled their ability to wage war, as human teams had destroyed their breeding facilities and manufacturing capabilities and command structures, and had scattered their population across dozens of remote star systems where they could no longer coordinate large-scale military operations, Major Sam Rodriguez explained the psychological principles behind human military doctrine. And he described how humanity's evolutionary heritage as persistence hunters had been translated into modern warfare techniques that emphasized intelligence gathering and precise targeting of enemy weaknesses rather than brute force confrontation. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Chang presented her analysis of human casualties during the operation and reported that Earth's forces had suffered exactly 0 deaths and fewer than a dozen minor injuries while eliminating a threat that had destroyed hundreds of alien warships and consumed billions of lives. The implications of this disparity in military effectiveness sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives, as they realized that humans were not just another predator species, but represented a level of military sophistication that made them potentially more dangerous than any threat the galaxy had previously faced. Ambassador Neith raised the question that was on every alien mind as she asked, what would happen if humanity ever decided that the peaceful species were a threat to Earth's interests? And Morrison's response was diplomatically phrased, but carried an unmistakable warning that such a situation would be extremely unwise for all concerned. The ceremony concluded with formal treaties establishing diplomatic relations between Earth and the 12 grateful civilizations. But the documents were carefully worded to avoid any suggestion of alliance or mutual defense obligations. And both sides understood that they were dealing with a relationship based on mutual respect rather than friendship. As the human delegation prepared to return to Earth, long-range sensors detected disturbing news from the galaxy's outer rim, where the Vrex hegemony had been monitoring the conflict and drawing their own conclusions about human military capabilities, and their expansion plans were being accelerated rather than abandoned. Admiral Morrison received intelligence reports about Vrex fleet movements and their apparent intention to test human resolve by attacking some of the species that Earth had just finished saving, and his response was to authorize the deployment of additional monitoring assets to track potential threats. Colonel Carter briefed his staff on the Vrex situation and explained that unlike the Korthak, who had been simple predators, the new threat appeared to be a militaristic empire that understood the principles of warfare and would require different tactics to defeat. But his confidence suggested that he welcomed the challenge. The alien representatives dispersed to their homeworlds, carrying with them a new understanding of their place in the galactic hierarchy and the knowledge that their survival now depended on the goodwill of creatures who could eliminate entire civilizations with casual efficiency. Children across 12 worlds began falling asleep to new bedtime stories as parents told them about the terrifying guardian monsters from Earth, who hunted in the dark between stars and ensured that peaceful species could sleep safely in their beds. But the stories carried warnings about what happened to those who betrayed the trust of the apex predators. The galaxy had learned a fundamental truth about the nature of power and protection, as the peaceful species discovered that sometimes the only defense against a dangerous enemy was to call upon something even more dangerous, and that such protection came with responsibilities and obligations that could never be ignored. Earth's forces returned to their homeworld, but left behind a network of monitoring stations and communication relays that would provide early warning of any future threats. And the message was clear that humanity would be watching, and that any species foolish enough to threaten the innocent would face the same fate as the Korthak Admiral Morrison established a new department within Earth Defense Force called Galactic Affairs, and its mission was to monitor potential threats to the peaceful species and to maintain the delicate balance between protection and non-interference that would allow humanity to coexist with its grateful but terrified neighbors. The final report on Operation Silent. Fang was classified at the highest levels, but its conclusions were shared with key government officials as Earth's leaders grappled with their new role as the galaxy's reluctant guardians and the responsibilities that came with being recognized. As the ultimate apex predators, Dr. Chang prepared cultural exchange programs that would help build understanding between humans and aliens. But her real purpose was to ensure that the peaceful species never forgot the lessons they had learned about, the consequences of threatening innocent life, and the swift justice that would follow. The cosmos had been forever changed by humanity's intervention, as the age of peaceful expansion and gradual exploration had ended and been replaced by a new era where survival depended on the protection of creatures who had evolved to hunt and kill anything that threatened them and their allies, as the twin suns of Zentara Prime sat behind the crystal dome of the Great Hall. The assembled alien representatives faced a future that was both safer and more uncertain than anything their species had previously experienced, and they understood that the galaxy would never again be the same peaceful place it had been before they sent their desperate message to the small blue world at the edge of known space. The first Korthak swarm ship died in complete silence as Sergeant Tony Mitchell and his infiltration team planted shaped charges throughout its neural control center, while the insectoid crew slept in their regeneration chambers and the massive vessel simply stopped moving as its command functions were severed and its hive mind connection was broken, leaving millions of warriors trapped aboard a dead ship drifting through space. The Korthak had never experienced anything like what the humans brought to their war, as the insectoids had evolved as apex predators on their homeworld, but they had only ever hunted prey species that fought in predictable ways and tried to defend territory or resources, and they had no concept of an enemy that simply appeared inside their most secure vessels and began killing from within. Lieutenant Amy Brooks moved through the dark corridors of a Korthak dreadnought with her squad following behind her in perfect silence, and the humans wore advanced stealth suits that masked their heat signatures and sound, and they navigated the alien ship using architectural plans that had been stolen during previous infiltrations, and their movements were coordinated with the precision of a wolf. The insectoids had designed their vessels under the assumption that their reputation for terror would prevent any species from attempting to board their ships, and their internal security was minimal because they had never encountered an enemy capable of infiltration, and the humans exploited this weakness with devastating efficiency as they systematically destroyed critical systems. Captain Susan Blake coordinated orbital strikes from her position aboard the EDS Night Hunter and her targeting. Solutions were based on intelligence gathered by the infiltration teams, and she could place explosive charges with surgical precision that would cripple Korthak vessels without destroying them completely, because dead ships told no tales, while disabled ships could be studied and analyzed. The Korthak Queen aboard the Central Command vessel experienced something she had never felt in her 300-year lifespan, as reports flooded in about ships going silent and warriors disappearing, and supply convoys being destroyed by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once but could never be found. And for the first time in her species' history, she felt the cold touch of fear. Commander Rachel Torres led a daring raid on a Korthak staging area where the insectoids had gathered their forces for a final assault on the Altarian homeworld, and her ships approached using stealth technology that made them invisible to Korthak sensors, and when they struck, it was with the sudden violence of predators ambushing unsuspecting prey. The human assault teams moved through Korthak facilities with the methodical efficiency of extermination specialists as they identified and eliminated key personnel and destroyed critical equipment, and their attacks were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to collapse the enemy's ability to function as an organized force. Major Sam Rodriguez established his command post on a captured Korthak vessel and used it as a base for launching additional infiltration missions, and the aliens watched in amazement as human forces turned the enemy's own ships against them and converted secure Korthak facilities into human staging areas with a speed that seemed impossible. The psychological impact on the Korthak was devastating as the insectoids discovered that their massive swarm ships offered no protection against an enemy that could appear anywhere at any time, and their hive mind mentality, which had been their greatest strength against other species, became a weakness when humans began systematically eliminating their command structures. Sergeant Mitchell led another team deep into the heart of a Korthak breeding facility where millions of warrior larvae were being prepared for the next wave of expansion, and the humans planted biological weapons that would ensure the larvae never reached maturity, and the facility was destroyed without any external evidence of sabotage. The Korthak tried to adapt their tactics to deal with the human threat, but their evolutionary programming worked against them as they could only think in terms of overwhelming force and direct confrontation, and they had no experience with an enemy that refused to fight on their terms and instead created new rules that favored intelligence over strength. Captain Blake monitored communications intercepts that revealed growing panic among Korthak forces as ship after ship went silent and entire battle groups simply disappeared, and the insectoids began to suspect that they were fighting ghosts or demons rather than a physical enemy, and their morale began to collapse under the pressure of facing an incomprehensible threat. The human operations expanded beyond simple sabotage. As infiltration teams began gathering intelligence about Korthak society and technology and culture, and they discovered that the insectoids were not as united as they appeared, and that there were competing factions within their hierarchy that could be exploited through careful manipulation, Commander Torres received reports from her intelligence specialists that the Korthak Empire was beginning to fracture as different hive clusters blamed each other for the military disasters, and the humans began feeding false information into Korthak communication networks that exacerbated these divisions and turned the insectoids against each other. Lieutenant Brooks and her team penetrated the inner sanctum of the Korthak Queen's flagship and planted surveillance devices that gave human forces real-time access to enemy strategic planning and the ability to anticipate Korthak movements and counter them before they could be implemented, and the insects found themselves fighting an enemy that always seemed to be one step ahead. The alien observers watched the human operations with a mixture of admiration and terror as they realized that Earth's forces were not just defeating the Korthak, but were systematically dismantling their entire civilization with a thoroughness that suggested this was not their first experience with extermination warfare, and that humanity had refined these techniques over centuries of practice. Admiral Morrison monitored the battle from Earth, command, and provided strategic guidance to his forces in the field, and he explained to the alien representatives that humans had learned through bitter experience that the only way to deal with an existential threat was to eliminate it completely, and that half measures only ensured that the enemy would return stronger. The Korthak made a desperate attempt to break through human lines and reach the core worlds where they could resume their consumption of planetary populations. But every move they made was anticipated and countered, and their massive fleets found themselves trapped in kill zones where human forces could destroy them. Piecemeal Sergeant Mitchell's team infiltrated the main Korthak communication hub and uploaded a virus into their quantum communication network that would spread throughout their empire and disrupt coordination between different swarm fleets, and the insectoids suddenly found themselves fighting blind as their ability to share information and coordinate strategy was systematically destroyed. The final phase of the human operation began when Captain Blake led a coordinated strike against the Korthak's primary staging worlds, where their forces had been gathering for the final assault on civilized. Space and the humans used orbital bombardment combined with ground assault to destroy the infrastructure that supported the enemy. War Machine Commander Torres received surrender communications from Korthak forces that had been cut off from their command structure and were no longer capable of organized resistance, and she accepted their surrender, but made it clear that any attempt to resume hostilities would result in complete extermination rather than capture. The Korthak Queen made a final desperate gambit as she attempted to lead the surviving forces in a direct assault on Earth itself, but human intelligence networks had anticipated this move, and Admiral Morrison was waiting with a reception that demonstrated why humans had evolved as the ultimate apex predators. The battle for Earth's solar system lasted less than 6 hours, as human forces used every weapon and tactic they had developed over their violent history to protect their homeworld, and when the last Korthak ship was destroyed, the insectoid empire effectively ceased to exist as an organized threat to galactic civilization. Major Rodriguez reported to Admiral Morrison that Operation Silent Fang had achieved complete success, and that the Korthak Dominion had been eliminated as a military force, and that their surviving populations were fleeing to the outer rim of the galaxy, where they would pose no threat to the peaceful species that had originally called for help. The alien representatives gathered aboard the human flagship to witness the formal end of hostilities, and they watched in silence as Commander Torres accepted the final surrender of Korthak forces and announced that the galaxy was now safe from the threat that had terrorized 12 civilizations and consumed 47 worlds. 6 ships appeared at the edge of Altarian space, like ghosts materializing from the void, and the vessels were unlike anything the desperate alien civilizations had ever seen, as they were sleek Predator-class destroyers painted in dark colors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their angular hulls bristled with weapon systems that had been designed for one purpose, which was to kill efficiently and without mercy. Commander Velox stood on the bridge of the evacuation ship that served as temporary headquarters for the Altarian government, and he stared at the human vessels with a mixture of hope and growing dread as he realized that Earth had sent only 6 ships to face the massive Korthak swarms that had destroyed hundreds of alien warships and consumed entire fleets without taking significant damage. The lead human vessel identified itself as the EDS Night Hunter, and its captain requested permission to dock with the Altarian command ship, and when the airlock cycled open, the aliens got their first look at the creatures they had begged for help, and what they saw made their worst fears about predator species seem understated and inadequate. Major Sam Rodriguez stepped through the airlock, followed by a squad of human soldiers, and the aliens immediately understood why their ancient files had been filled with warnings as the humans moved with the fluid grace of natural killers, and their eyes constantly scanned for threats, and their hands never strayed far from their weapons, even in what should have been a peaceful diplomatic meeting. Commander Rachel Torres followed with her naval officers, and the humans wore dark uniforms covered in equipment that the aliens could not identify. but which clearly served military purposes, and their faces showed the kind of calm confidence that only came from beings who had never doubted their ability to kill anything that threatened them. Velox tried to maintain his composure as he welcomed the human delegation, but his forearms trembled as he explained the tactical situation and showed holographic displays of the Korthak advance and the massive swarm ships that carried millions of insectoid warriors, and he emphasized that the enemy outnumbered any possible human force by thousands to one. Major Rodriguez studied the tactical displays with professional interest, and his expression never changed as he absorbed the information about Korthak fleet movements and composition. And when Velox finished his briefing, the human officer simply nodded and asked a few technical questions about enemy command structures and supply lines that revealed he was thinking about the problem in ways that had never occurred to the alien. Military planners Ambassador Ninth from the Prism Worlds activated her crystalline form and projected additional data about previous battles with the Korthak, and she showed how alien fleets had been systematically destroyed, despite having technological advantages and superior defensive capabilities. And she emphasized that the insectoids seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of warriors, and Ship's Commander Torres examined the battle footage with the same calm professionalism as her ground forces counterpart, and she asked detailed questions about Korthak ship construction and boarding procedures and internal security measures, and the aliens began to realize that the humans were not thinking about fighting the enemy fleets, but about getting inside them. Senior Counselor Zeph activated the main display and showed the current positions of Korthak forces and the projected timeline for their arrival at the core worlds, and he explained that the alien evacuation fleets were already overloaded with refugees and that there was nowhere left to run, and that this was quite literally the last hope for 12 different civilizations. Rodriguez looked at the massive scope of the threat and the impossible odds, and then he turned to Velox with something that might have been amusement in his dark eyes as he said that the aliens had asked Earth for help dealing with an infestation, and that humans had considerable experience with pest control, and that the Korthak were about to learn why apex predators had earned that classification. The human forces deployed from their ships with an efficiency that amazed and terrified the alien observers as teams of soldiers moved through the docking bays, carrying equipment that seemed designed for infiltration and sabotage rather than conventional warfare, and their movements were coordinated with the precision of a pack hunting together. Lieutenant Amy Brooks led her squad onto the alien command ship, and the peaceful beings instinctively backed away from the human soldiers as some deep evolutionary programming warned them that these creatures were dangerous in ways that their civilized minds could not fully comprehend, and the humans seemed to radiate an aura of controlled violence that made the aliens deeply uncomfortable. The human battle plan was unlike anything the aliens had ever considered, as Rodriguez explained that his forces would not engage the Korthak fleets in direct combat, but would instead infiltrate the massive swarm ships and systematically destroy them from within, using techniques that had been developed during humanity's long history of warfare against other predator species. Commander Torres outlined the naval component of the operation, which involved using human stealth technology to approach Korthak vessels undetected and deploy boarding parties that would target critical systems and command structures rather than trying to match the enemy ship for ship, and her casual confidence in discussing infiltration of vessels the size of small moons left the aliens speechless. Captain Tony Mitchell briefed the alien commanders on human special operations doctrine, and he explained that humans had evolved as persistence hunters, which meant they could track and kill prey much larger and stronger than themselves by using intelligence and cooperation and endurance rather than brute force, and that the same principles applied to military operations. The aliens watched in fascination and horror as the human soldiers prepared their equipment, which included weapons designed for close quarters, combat and explosives that could destroy critical ship systems and infiltration gear that would allow them to move through enemy vessels without being detected, and every piece of equipment had been refined over centuries of human warfare. Sergeant Susan Blake demonstrated some of the human weapons to the alien observers, and the peaceful beings recoiled in terror as they realized that humans had devoted enormous resources to developing increasingly efficient methods of killing, and that their entire technological civilization was built around the fundamental assumption that violence was inevitable and necessary. The psychological impact on the aliens was immediate and profound, as they began to understand that they had invited creatures into their territory who were potentially more dangerous than the Korthak themselves, and that humans represented an entirely different kind of threat that operated according to principles that herbivorous prey species could barely comprehend. Rodriguez addressed the growing fear among the alien representatives by explaining that humans distinguished between threats and innocent civilians, and that Earth's forces were here to protect the peaceful species rather than conquer them, but his words carried an implicit warning that this protection came with expectations and obligations. The final briefing took place in the main conference room, where human and alien officers gathered around holographic displays showing Korthak fleet positions, and the aliens watched in amazement as the humans identified weaknesses and vulnerabilities that had never occurred to prey species' minds, and developed attack plans that seemed suicidally aggressive but were based on sophisticated analysis of enemy psychology. Commander Torres explained that the Korthak had evolved as apex predators on their homeworld, but had only ever hunted prey species and had never encountered another predator civilization, and that their tactics and ship designs reflected this limitation, and that they would be completely unprepared for the kind of warfare that humans considered routine. Major Rodriguez concluded the briefing by stating that Operation Silent Fang would commence immediately, and that human forces would demonstrate to the galaxy why Earth had been classified as too dangerous for normal diplomatic contact, and that the Korthak Dominion was about to face something they had never encountered in their long history of conquest, which was an enemy that hunted hunters. As the human teams dispersed to their assault ships, the aliens gathered in small groups and whispered among themselves about what they had just witnessed, and slowly the realization spread through their ranks that they had not just called for help, but had unleashed something into the galaxy that might change the fundamental balance of power forever, and that the peaceful age of their civilizations was ending regardless of who won the coming battle. The message from the desperate aliens reached Earth's orbital defense platforms 3 days after transmission, and the quantum communication arrays immediately forwarded the signal to Luna Command, where Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the main briefing room surrounded by holographic displays showing star charts and alien fleet movements as his senior staff worked to decode and analyze what might be humanity's first contact with an organized galactic civilization. Dr. Lisa Chang, head of the Xenocultural Studies Division, had been working around the clock with teams of linguists and computer specialists to break down the alien language patterns, and when she finally cracked the code, the contents of the message sent shockwaves through the entire Earth Defense Force command structure, as the aliens were not offering trade or diplomatic relations, but were literally begging for military assistance against something called the Korthak. Dominion Morrison read the translated message. Several times as he tried to process what he was seeing, and according to the aliens, 12 different species were facing complete extinction at the hands of insectoid warriors who consumed entire planets and had already destroyed 47 worlds and were advancing toward the core systems of galactic civilization, and the desperate tone of the message made it clear that these beings had nowhere else to turn. Captain Ryan Torres Morrison's chief tactical advisor pulled up the star charts that had been included with the alien transmission and began plotting the locations of the various species and their territories. And what he found was a collection of worlds that seemed to have developed along completely different evolutionary paths than Earth, as the aliens appeared to be herbivorous species that had never developed serious military capabilities. Dr. Chang presented her analysis of the alien cultural data that had been embedded in the message, and her findings painted a picture of civilizations that had evolved from prey animals and had built their societies around concepts of cooperation and peaceful coexistence rather than competition and conflict. And she explained that these species literally could not comprehend the kind of organized violence that humans considered normal. The briefing room fell silent as the implications became clear, and General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Earth's ground forces, pointed out that the aliens were asking humanity to intervene in what amounted to an interstellar war, and that Earth had no obligations to these species and no knowledge of what they might be getting themselves into if they responded to the plea for help. Colonel Danny Carter, a veteran of the Mars colonial conflicts and currently head of special operations, leaned back in his chair with a predatory smile as he studied the tactical data about the Korthak forces, and he pointed out that while the alien numbers looked impressive, they appeared to be designed for overwhelming weaker opponents rather than fighting against organized resistance, and their tactics seemed to rely on brute force rather than sophisticated strategy. Morrison asked Dr. Chang to explain more about the psychological profiles of both the requesting species and their enemies, and she activated a holographic display that showed comparative evolutionary data, and according to her analysis, the peaceful aliens had developed advanced technology, but had never needed to develop what humans would recognize as military science because they had never faced serious existential threats. The Korthak, on the other hand, appeared to be a hive mind species that had evolved as apex predators on their home world, but had only ever hunted prey species and had never encountered another predator civilization, and their expansion pattern suggested they simply overwhelmed their targets with superior numbers and consumed everything they found rather than engaging in actual warfare. Captain Torres brought up fleet composition data that showed the Korthak operated massive swarm ships that relied on deploying huge numbers of individual warriors rather than coordinated tactical units. And he pointed out that their formations were designed for intimidation and overwhelming force rather than strategic flexibility, and that they seemed to have no concept of asymmetric warfare or guerrilla tactics. Colonel Carter stood up and walked to the holographic display showing Korthak ship designs, and he pointed out several critical vulnerabilities in their massive vessels, including the fact that they appeared to have minimal internal security and relied entirely on their reputation for terror to prevent boarding actions and infiltration attempts. And he suggested that a small force of properly trained humans could cause devastating damage to such targets. General Hayes argued for caution, as she pointed out that Earth's military forces were designed for fighting other humans and defending the solar system, and that they had no experience with alien psychology or technology, and that committing forces to an interstellar conflict could leave Earth vulnerable to other threats that they did not Yet Know About Dr. Chong interrupted the debate by projecting her final analysis of the situation, and she explained that the requesting aliens represented what appeared to be the most advanced peaceful civilizations in the galaxy, and that if they were destroyed, the galaxy would be left to species like the Korthak, and that humanity might eventually face the same threat, but without any allies. And with the insectoids having grown even stronger. Morrison studied the data for several minutes, as he considered the implications of either responding or ignoring the alien plea, and he realized that this decision would fundamentally change humanity's position in the galaxy, and that there was no way to remain neutral once they knew about the larger galactic situation and the threats that existed beyond their solar system. The tactical assessment team led by Captain Torres presented their preliminary analysis of how human forces might perform against Korthak swarms, and their conclusion was that while the aliens were correct that the insectoids had overwhelming numerical superiority, they were fighting like predators who had never encountered organized resistance, and their tactics were completely unsuited for dealing with human military doctrine. Colonel Carter outlined a potential operation that would use small elite forces rather than large fleets, and he explained that humans could take advantage of their evolutionary heritage as persistence hunters to systematically target Korthak command structures and supply lines rather than engaging in the kind of direct confrontation that had destroyed the alien fleets. The discussion continued for hours as the senior staff debated the risks and benefits of intervention, and slowly a consensus began to emerge that this was exactly the kind of threat that Earth's military had been designed to handle, and that the aliens had unknowingly contacted the one species in the galaxy that was psychologically and tactically equipped to fight the Korthak effectively. Admiral Morrison finally called for quiet and announced his decision, as he said that Earth would respond to the alien request, but not in the way that the desperate species expected, and instead of sending massive fleets and armies, they would deploy what humans did best, which was small, highly trained units designed to cause maximum disruption with minimal resources. The operation was designated Silent Fang, and Colonel Carter was given command of the ground forces while Captain Torres would lead the naval component, and their mission would be to demonstrate to the galaxy that humans were not just another prey species, but were in fact the apex predators that the ancient files had warned about. Dr. Chang was tasked with preparing cultural briefings for the human forces, so they would understand the psychology of both their alien allies and their enemies. And she emphasized that the peaceful species would be terrified of humans almost as much as they feared the Korthak, and that the operation would need to be conducted with careful attention to maintaining the trust of their new allies. As the senior staff dispersed to begin preparations, Morrison stood alone in the briefing room, looking at the star charts that showed the locations of dozens of civilizations, and he realized that humanity was about to announce its presence to the galaxy in the most dramatic way possible, and that nothing would ever be the same after human forces engaged the Korthak Dominion. The message sent back to the aliens was brief and professional, as Morrison simply stated that Earth had received their request for assistance and that human forces would be dispatched to help deal with the Korthak threat. And he concluded by saying that the galaxy was about to learn why humans were classified as apex predators, and that the peaceful species should prepare themselves for a very different kind of war. The Great Hall of Zentara Prime stretched out like a vast crystal dome beneath the twin suns of the Altarian system, and within its walls 12 different alien species sat in desperate silence as their worlds burned across the galaxy. And Commander Velox of the Altarian Federation stood at the center podium, with his 4 blue arms trembling as he looked at the assembled representatives of what might be the last free civilizations in known space. The holographic displays around the chamber showed the same terrible story over and over again as world after world fell to the advancing swarms of the Korthak Dominion, and the insectoid warriors moved through space like a plague, consuming everything in their path and leaving only dead. Worlds behind them, and Velox had watched his own homeworld of Altair 7 evacuated just 3 days ago, as billions of his people fled in whatever ships they could find. Ambassador Nith from the Prism Worlds activated her crystalline form and projected images that made every being in the chamber flinch in horror, as the footage showed Korthak swarm ships, each one the size of a small moon, descending on peaceful planets, and the insectoids poured out like a living flood, devouring not just the inhabitants, but every living thing they could find, from the smallest plant to the largest animal. And when they were done, they moved on, leaving nothing but barren rock behind. The Dracorian representative senior counselor, Zeph, shifted his massive reptilian form and spoke in his deep, gravelly voice that echoed through the chamber as he said that 47 worlds had fallen in the past 2 years, and the Korthak showed no signs of slowing down, and their scouts reported that the main swarm was now heading directly toward the core worlds, where most of their civilizations had their capitals and military centers. A small furry delegate from the Whisker Confederation squeaked in terror as she reported that her people had tried to negotiate with the Korthak and had sent diplomatic envoys with offers of tribute and resources, but the insectoids had simply consumed the envoys and continued their advance without even acknowledging the attempts at communication. And it was becoming clear that the Korthak had no interest in conquest or slavery, but only in complete consumption of all life they encountered. The crystalline being Nith projected tactical reports that showed the military situation was hopeless, as the combined fleets of all 12 species had been systematically destroyed in every engagement with the Korthak forces, and the insectoids seemed to have an endless supply of warriors and ships, while the peaceful civilizations had never developed the kind of military technology needed to fight such a relentless enemy, and their defensive strategies were useless against an enemy that simply overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. Velox activated another display that showed the projected timeline of the Korthak advance, and according to their best calculations, the swarm would reach the Altarian homeworld within 6 months, and the other core worlds would fall within a year, and after that there would be nowhere left to run, and the peaceful species of the galaxy would simply cease to exist, and their billions of years of evolution and culture would be erased as if they had never existed. The mood in the chamber grew even darker, as delegate after delegate reported the same story of evacuations and desperate retreats and failed military operations, and it became clear that conventional warfare was not going to save them, and they needed something else, something that none of their civilizations possessed. And Senior Counselor Zeph suggested that perhaps it was time to look beyond their usual diplomatic channels and seek help from sources they had previously avoided. A nervous Altarian aide approached Velox and whispered something in his ear, and the commander's expression changed from despair to confusion as he accessed the ancient galactic archives and brought up a file that had been sealed for over 300 years, and the display showed information about a small blue world in an unremarkable star system at the edge of civilized space, and the planet was called Earth, and its inhabitants were listed as humans. The file contained warnings in dozens of languages, and the text was marked with symbols that indicated extreme caution was advised when dealing with this species. And there were notes about aggressive territorial behavior, and something called apex predator classification. And most disturbing of all, there were reports of what the humans called warfare, and the descriptions made even the bravest delegates in the chamber uncomfortable as they read about organized violence on a scale that their peaceful minds could barely comprehend. Ambassador Nith projected the human file for all to see, and the assembled representatives stared in fascination and horror at images of the third planet from a yellow star, and the world seemed to be covered in vast oceans and continents, and the life forms that had evolved there were unlike anything in their experience. And according to the reports, humans had evolved as what their scientists called persistence hunters, and they had developed the ability to chase down and kill prey much larger and stronger than themselves. The file contained fragments of intercepted human communications and cultural data that painted a picture of a species that had spent most of its evolutionary history fighting and killing not just other species but each other. And they had developed weapons and tactics that were designed for one purpose, which was to efficiently destroy other living beings, and the reports mentioned something called military science, which was apparently the systematic study of how to wage war more effectively. Senior Counselor Zeph read from the file in his deep voice, and the words sent chills through every being present as he described how humans had covered their entire planet with fortifications and weapons and had divided themselves into competing groups that constantly prepared for war against each other, and even their entertainment and sports involved simulated combat, and their literature and art were filled with stories of violence and conquest. The Whisker Confederation delegate pointed out that the humans had been classified as too dangerous for normal diplomatic contact, and that previous attempts to establish relations had been abandoned after human responses had been deemed unpredictable and potentially hostile, and there were notes indicating that human psychology was fundamentally different from that of prey species, and that they exhibited predator mentality on both individual and collective levels. Velox studied the data more carefully and found references to human military capabilities that seemed almost impossible to believe, as the reports described weapons that could destroy entire cities and vehicles that could move faster than anything the peaceful species had ever built. And there were mentions of something called special forces, which were apparently elite groups of humans trained specifically for infiltration and assassination missions. The debate that followed was heated as some delegates argued that contacting such a dangerous species would be like inviting another predator into their territory, while others pointed out that they were already facing extinction and had nothing left to lose, and Ambassador Nith suggested that perhaps a predator species might be exactly what they needed to fight the Korthak, since all their peaceful methods had failed as the twin sons of Zentara Prime began to set through the Crystal Dome. The representatives faced the most difficult decision in their civilization's history, and they could either maintain their principles and face certain extinction at the hands of the Korthak, or they could reach out to a species that terrified them almost as much as their current enemy, and hope that humans would be willing to help, rather than simply adding to their problems. Senior Counselor Zeph called for a final vote, and one by one the delegates cast their decision. And when the count was finished, the result was unanimous, as every species had voted to send a message to the distant world of Earth and ask for help from the apex predators who lived there, and Velox was tasked with composing the transmission that would either save their civilizations or doom them in an entirely different way. The message was simple and desperate as Velox spoke into the recording device, with his voice shaking from fear and exhaustion. And he said that peaceful species across the galaxy were dying, and that an enemy called the Korthak was consuming entire worlds, and that they had nowhere else to turn. And he ended with words that would echo across space for days as he said, "Please help us." And the transmission was sent toward the small blue world at the edge of known space, where creatures called humans waited in the darkness between the stars.